got some questions about fibre, concerns about lowering carbohydrate intake and also lowering fibre. So we get a lot of fibre from fruit, for example. You just demonised fruit.
And part of
do we need fibre, and where do we get the fibre?
These are all fantastic questions, and we're trying to decide on the lecture series today. This is another lecture. The fructose lecture is another lecture, and it really is a problem to try and fit everything in. So we'll try and work our way through them as best we can. Paul likes this one as well.
So I guess question surrounding how important is fibre? Where do we get our fibre if we need fibre? And is there a difference between soluble and non-soluble fibre?
So absolutely there is. So first of all, soluble and insoluble fibre. Nobody knows. If I told you that blueberries and blackberries had a different type of fibre in them, or strawberries rather and blackberries, you wouldn't be able to tell which one was soluble and insoluble. It's a really quite an ephemeral concept. But when I was looking at fibre a couple of years ago, I wanted to go back to the root research, and I said, where is the evidence that fibre is good for health, good for constipation, good for bowel mobility? Because everybody knows that. And you know what? The evidence isn't there. There was only one study that was semi-randomised that trialled people on different levels of fibre in their diet to have a look at their symptoms like constipation and bloating and all of that. And do you know what it found? It found that the diets with the highest levels of fibre had the worst symptoms. Now, is that such a strange thing to think about? Everybody here has probably heard of malabsorption syndrome. What is the concept of that? You eat something, let's say you're lactose intolerant. Your body can't digest lactose. It lacks lactase, the enzyme, to break it down into glucose and galactose. So this two-part sugar, disaccharide, ends up in your colon where it gets feasted on by bacteria. And those bacteria then produce gas. You end up being bloated. What's the whole premise of fibre? It's undigestible carbohydrate. Where does it end up? In the colon. What happens then? It gets feasted on by bacteria. Is the whole premise of fibre really that different to what we call malabsorption syndrome?
Anyone else like fibre? I mean, so what if somebody's constipated?
So that's a different question altogether.
Okay.
So the question
people
is,
generally believe if you're constipated.
Okay, so in my experience, Rod can talk about this, and certainly Paul's experience, the biggest problem when people are constipated, number one, they're not eating enough fat. So they've embraced the low carb, but they haven't gone high fat. Okay. Number two, they don't have enough salt in their diet. Right? And those are the two big things. You get people to take enough fat and enough salt, the constipation goes away. And of course, magnesium as well.
So let's think about it mechanistically. So we said that fluid follows salt. In paediatrics, I'm sure there's a few GPs here who work with children. If you have constipation in a child, the first thing you do is get them to drink more water. Because if you want to soften the stool and ease the transit through the gastrointestinal tract, you want it to be moistened. So if you're running a fluid deficit because you're salt deficient, because you're heeding advice and having minimal salt in the diet, that ends up leading the body with a decision. Do I have this fluid in the stool, or do I bring it back into the vasculature where it's needed? And that's a pretty obvious, easy decision for the body to make. So the end result is that when I have people with constipation, if they increase their salt in their diet, that constipation usually improves.
Great, and you've got to remember there are people in the world, and there are people in the very low carb community who eat nothing but meat. They've eaten it for years. There are families that eat nothing but ribeye steak. They're in good health. Yes, the frequency of their bowel movements is decreased, but constipation doesn't seem to be a problem for them. So just the whole idea of fibre, how badly do we need it? I think we've got to work it out for ourselves how much fibrous veggies we need to add in to our diets to ensure good bowel functioning for us.
And just on that, we hear a lot about having to consume low GI carbohydrates. Is it worth consuming low GI carbohydrates for taming the insulin response?
Okay, so in my talk, I talked about that that once the carbohydrate hits the stomach and gets digested, what does it become? Okay, so if it's low glycemic index, it might just happen a little bit later, but it's still going to be sugar. So my personal answer to that is it's a waste of time. Sugar is sugar is sugar, whether it absorbs a little bit faster or a little bit slower.
We had Dr. Kaplan talk about not eating processed meats, and we've had some curious questions about processed meats. What specifically are processed meats? Salamis, prosciuttos, bacon? What's your view on that?
I think Jason's done well to get out of answering this one. I'm happy to give this one a crack. So look, there are some things. We talked about advanced glycosylated end products earlier. We said they're not very good. And you can actually get them from meat. Your body can make them, but you can also ingest them. And we suspect that ingesting them is probably not great. But the main concern that a lot of people tell me when they have preserved meats is, what about the preservatives? The nitrates in bacon, for instance. So I like to ask, what's got more nitrate, a hot dog or celery? Celery.
Celery. I'll translate.
What?
Celery.
Okay, I'll just put my dentures back in now. Now, the highest concentration of nitrates in a food that I know of is beetroot juice. And we actually use this in athletes for performance enhancement. It leads to improved blood flow to the exercising muscles and several other effects. So this whole concern about nitrates as a preservative, I don't see it. I certainly do believe that there is a concern about charring the meat. Certainly we know that you can reduce some of these aromatic chemicals and advanced glycosylated end products if you cooked your meat in a moist fashion. And certainly you should avoid oils that have a low smoke point because we think that they can give off some carcinogenic compounds. But overall, I think if you're cooking your meat at a reasonable temperature, and here's the thing, if you have grass-fed meat, there's been shown to be a significant reduction in E. coli levels. That meat is far healthier than grain-fed. Why? I don't know, but that's what the data shows. So grass-fed meat, you don't need to blacken it to cook it. Cook it on a low heat, maybe moist heat. It's probably not going to be that bad for you. I still love my meat.
But the other thing you have to be careful with a lot of the processed foods is processing may add salt to it, may add sugar to it. And so you have to be able to read that nutrition label very carefully and also understand that the guidelines that the people are following with nutrition labels might say if it's 5 parts per thousand or something like that, we can label it as 0. So just because you see 0 on the label doesn't actually necessarily mean that there's 0 of that product in that food. And if you can't recognise what you're eating as food, if I put it in front of you and it's like a pressed piece of meat and you can't tell me what animal it came from, my theory is probably you shouldn't be eating that. Okay, just because it's a lot more processed and all the processing steps add generally chemicals and other things which we don't need in our body. So I can't tell you that the processed meat is definitely going to kill you or cause problems for you, but as a philosophical thing, I generally would say that they are not as good as being able to recognise what you eat.
Yeah, I'd like to chip in to say I don't have that much processed meat, but I don't avoid it. The evidence against it is very weak. It's epidemiological, observational data with low hazard ratios. It's a bit like, does red meat cause cancer? I think the answer is no. It is, any association is just an association. And it may well be that, for example, the people in the US who eat the most meat eat the most hamburgers. And they also drink the most Coca-Cola. And were we able to separate out the Coca-Cola from the hamburgers, and I think the answer is no, it's almost impossible to do. In any event, it was a pretty weak association. So I'd put processed meats in the basket of urban myth. And after all, lots of tribal people have been smoking meats and preserving them for thousands and thousands of years. Yep.
So as a follow-up to that, Rod, that's a really astute comment about the epidemiological studies being methodologically flawed. So for instance, some of the big studies the people who were eating pizza, that was ticked off as eating red meat because there's red meat on the pizza. So your typical hot dog meal, you go to a fast food outlet, you have a hot dog, you have a Coke, red meat group. So the research that Rod was just talking about is fundamentally flawed.